Key to Life.
Hello, this is Sekou Burmese, your host of The Lit Review, a podcast brought to you by the Academy of Management Journal. In this podcast, we dive into the insights of recent research published in the journal and interview authors to discuss the inspiration for their ideas and how these insights apply to current pressing issues in organizations and markets. Have you ever been in a meeting and found that there was an elephant in the room? This is a phrase that describes a meeting where everyone is uncomfortable about something, but no one is willing to speak about it. It's a great example about how displays of emotion can have a strong effect on how we meet and how we make important decisions in organizations. My guest in this episode of The Lit Review is Christy Shropshire, corporate governance scholar extraordinaire and associate professor at Arizona State University. Recently, Christy published a paper about the role of displayed emotions, specifically anger and happiness, in corporate board meetings. In our conversation in this episode, I talk with Christy about the findings of this paper, and we delve into understanding the role that emotions play within our organizations and within our everyday meetings. I hope that you enjoy this episode of The Lit Review and my discussion with Christy Shropshire. My guest today on the Lit Review podcast is Christy Shropshire, an associate professor of management and entrepreneurship in the W.P. Carey School of Business at Arizona State University. Christy is a prominent scholar in corporate governance, ethics, and diversity in organizations. Her work focuses on how board composition, executive decision-making, and diversity initiatives influence firm performance and ethical outcomes. She has contributed greatly to our understanding of the impact that gender and racial diversity have on corporate boards and how this shapes strategic decisions. Hello, Christy, and welcome to the Lit Review podcast.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
So I'd like to start by discussing a recent AMJ paper that you had entitled More Than a Feeling: How Board Member Displays of Anger and Happiness Influence Strategic Decisions, that you published with Koen van den Oever. The paper explores the role of emotion displays in board meetings. It's a really interesting idea. I can't wait to dive into the specifics with you. But before we get into that, I always like to ask a big picture question, and this is your area of expertise. What got you interested in corporate governance and understanding how boards operate and how they are configured?
Sure. Yeah. So I've studied boards for a long time. Actually, before I got my PhD, I was a consultant. And as a 21, 23-year-old, I got to sit in on corporate board meetings, kind of as the new junior consultant.
Mm-hmm.
So I saw a lot of these interactions unfold. And then I got my PhD in academia, and a lot of our corporate governance studies and our theories are really based on assumptions of rationality and objectivity, that, these are kind of even-keeled, calm, almost like mechanistic groups that are at the top of organizations. And our empirical studies also trying to kind of measure what happens in those settings, or doing things like counting demographic characteristics or counting like the number of board meetings and running regression analyses and looking at outcomes like stock price. So these factors that are just really far apart from each other. So I was interested in this topic because, these are people at the top of organizations, and they do have huge influence over those outcomes, but it's through their decision making. And especially thinking back to when I would be in like compensation committee meetings, these are people interacting, not necessarily being, purely rational or being objective. So I got interested in this specific topic. This paper started with a conversation back at Academy in Boston in 2019.
Oh, wow.
So Koen and I talked
in the before times. Yes.
The very last Academy. And Koen and I talked about this really cool data that he has. It's board meetings of Dutch water management organizations. And so we kind of had this shared interest in the opportunity that we could observe these emotional displays during meetings and maybe test how they impact decision.
Yeah. So it's a fascinating topic. And, the idea of boards I kind of knew what they were. I had this vision of them. And then, of course, once you start reading the literature, you realize some of those lay theories about boards are not always correct. So because I haven't an expert here, can you describe what is the role of a board? And you study large publicly traded companies primarily, but I know you studied others. But for when we think about the board of directors, I watch Succession, I watch Industry, and the board is here. Oh, the board, you got to answer the board. Okay. What is the board and what is their role in the organization?
So the board is an interesting group because it's composed of individuals who have careers at other organizations. Maybe they're retired from longtime executive careers, and then they serve at this organization as kind of a part-time outside member. And they come together a handful of times a year, and they're largely approving or discussing the strategic decisions and the direction and vision of the organization going forward. So you have the top management team that are internal to the organization, and there are certain decisions as a publicly traded company that the top managers have to have the board's approval. And so they meet and they have these discussions, they have an agenda that they're looking over in advance and prepared materials. And then they come together and they have some discussions to decide, do we approve these? Do we want to have further discussion about what should happen next? And then those decisions that have to be put up for a board vote, the company cannot pursue something like, say, an acquisition without having the board's approval on a decision like that.
So the way you described it is as an approval body, which is absolutely the case. But I think the idea I had in my head was the board monitors and, they're the taskmasters. They have the ruler in their hands. They smack the hand of the CEOs or the CFOs if they're getting out of, doing things that go against shareholder value. But I think there's been recent research, and I think you're someone that, argues this in the paper that, like you said, the boards are people. And so their relationship to the executives is a little more complex than just the approver, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think this is back to what I was saying initially, that a lot of our theories and assumptions about how boards operate is that they're, maybe these rubber stamping groups, or they're just there, like you said, to monitor and to say no if something's going awry. But in fact, if you talk to directors, a lot of them talk about their job more as a strategic advisor, or we're a partner. We want to help improve the performance and improve this organization, especially folks that are at maybe retired and they've moved on from their own executive career. Some of them see this as a service role, that they really are serving these other organizations as a way to share their expertise and their experience in a way that can benefit other organizations.
Yeah. And so in thinking about the board as advisors and ones that are, almost people that the executives can go to for advice and help and guidance, I think that aligns very nicely with this idea of, well, these meetings aren't just I pitch to the board says yay or nay, they adjudicate, and then we're out of there. There is a lot of these dynamics around, okay, here's an idea, and now we negotiate, we talk. And so with that said, right, your paper does a great job of kind of saying, all right, if that is the case, then how do emotions play? We know cognitively, we know backgrounds, we know demographics, those kind of things, but emotions matter, right? And I think anyone that's ever been in a meeting knows emotions dictate how meetings go, sometimes more so than the actual content. And so what are kind of the central findings that you and Kuhn find in this paper, looking at the role of emotions in governance?
Yeah, so as background for the paper, we draw on this kind of psychological framework that's called emotions as social information. And we're looking at how two specific emotions, we focus on anger and happiness, how that shapes whether an individual director can sway or can change the strategic decision that's proposed by the CEO. So just as a background for our context, for these Dutch water management organizations, they see the agenda before the meeting, all the board members do. For each agenda item, the CEO is proposing what to do. And the board can vote to approve it. They can have some discussion. Board members can also suggest their own alternative solution. So our central findings are that anger and happiness operate through two distinct pathways of influence. So we look at anger as this signal of there's a problem. There, might be this sense of urgency that we need to act. And we call that the focused pathway of influence. Because what we find is that when a director has these high displays, what we call peak displays of anger when they're speaking, that makes the CEO much more likely to acquiesce, to change what he or she had proposed to what the director is suggesting. So that's one, what we call the focus pathway. And then another of our central findings is studying happiness, is what we call a diffuse pathway of influence, because that can signal, I'm passionate about this. It might kind of encourage the general boardroom's receptivity to their ideas. And so with these kind of peak displays of happiness, when a director's speaking, that makes the board much more likely to vote in favor of that director's proposal instead of what the CEO had originally proposed.
So this is great. I will ask the very naive question, which is, what is an example of peak display of anger and peak display of happiness?
So it's video data. And what we do with the video data is freeze frame video images into photos that can be run through an AI tool that measures the level of emotions displayed at each second that a person is speaking. And so there's been a lot of research on emotions that looks at, is it the average level that matters? Is it the peak level that matters? And most of the research points to it's the peak level of emotion displayed that has an impact. And so we control for all of the other, average emotions of the speaker, of everybody else in the room. But the peak level is the kind of the highest level of that emotion displayed while the person is speaking.
And is this verbal or nonverbal?
All nonverbal.
All nonverbal. So this is an angry face. This isn't
Correct.
saying I am angry. This is, I look over at Christy and you have a look on your face that's like, I'm about to explode.
Correct. And our reviewers push back some on does this tool work? And so we had to do a bunch of kind of follow-up studies with human coders to show that indeed it is I can recognize this is anger, this is peak anger, this is happiness. And it's actually 8 different emotions that we code. Just for this theory, we focus on anger and happiness.
Got it. All right. And happiness is smiling and okay. All right. So with that the case, so yes, I interrupted you with my request for an example. So central findings, things that you found were important to take away, the diffuse pathway and the focus pathway, and that they're effective in different ways in changing the way the board will decide or vote certain things, right?
Right. Whether what the director is saying actually changes the outcome of the decision.
Got it. All right. And so any unexpected findings? I know this was a bit of a grounded approach, so you kind of adjusted as you found things, but was there anything unexpected that you saw throughout this? Maybe even things that didn't make it into the paper?
Yes, I think maybe most surprising is what we didn't find. So our editorial team pushed us really, really hard on moderators that, we have these direct effects, and our original submission actually didn't change that much to the final, because we had these two, anger and happiness with these 2 different pathways. And then the one interaction that we had proposed initially is that the longer the discussion unfolds, the longer how long we spend talking about this particular agenda item, the longer that drags on, the weaker the effect of anger is. And we find that we also had hypothesized that happiness would get stronger, and we don't find that statistically significant. But that was the original paper, and the reviewers pushed us really hard that there has to be more about the individual director, the power dynamic, what's the decision topic that's being discussed, how are others responding, when is that peak emotion displayed? Is it the first 10 seconds or the last 10 seconds? So I have a list of 38 moderators that we tested, that we reported through all these rounds of revision, and nothing else was ever even close. Nothing that we tried to capture, is this director, are there demographics of the board member speaking, the tenure, are they part of the dominant coalition in power? So many different factors that we tested and did not find anything that offset those direct effects.
Wow. Okay. So emotions are without context. They are singular in their impact. Doesn't matter who does it, how long they've been there, male, female, in group, out group, it has an effect. That is surprising.
Surprising, yeah.
I wasn't a reviewer, but I probably would have asked you, like, oh no, it's got to be. Okay. Well, I'm almost tempted to ask, what do you make of that? Of the fact that it does not seem to be moderated by these things. Have you thought of a potential explanation, or it's maybe the next paper?
Right. So for this project, I mean, we truly went for what else can we possibly capture? We agree that there's power dynamics in these groups, and surely something else matters. I think one potential explanation is that this context is specifically Dutch water management organizations. So we're not looking across industries. We're not looking, at all different size and publicly traded private organizations. And so perhaps it is, in this setting that maybe power dynamics aren't as big a factor, or maybe some of the other dynamics and different individual differences that would matter in other contexts, we just don't see in this particular setting.
It could just be the Dutch. They're just singular in their view on emotions. They don't care where it comes from. They're very empathetic, the Dutch. All right. Well, so that actually leads me to another question I had, which is thinking about where you build on this, because I mean, we have all been in meetings and we have all experienced how emotions can derail a meeting, make a meeting good, bad. I took to an AI website. I don't want to give anybody props because they're not paying me for sponsorship, but I just put in, what are some examples of like idioms that we use around emotional shifts in meetings? And so I thought about these. The mood in the room changed on a dime. Tensions were running high. The air was thick with tension. The room went cold, right? These are all things that I think we have described probably a meeting. And these are all linked to this idea of emotion. And so you looked at anger and happiness in a very particular way. What other ways do you think that future research should start to look into this? And it could be your own, but just maybe other things that you've been thinking about as it relates to this.
Yeah, I definitely think other emotions probably matter, right? Like we focus on anger and happiness. There's been a good deal of work on sadness, and other discrete emotions. I think they probably operate in different pathways and in different ways, perhaps more complex. There's also been some recent work, and actually the next immediate project that Kuhn and I are tackling is exploring humor among top managers and board members. Different types of humor, and to match what they display with what they say. So in this paper, it's purely visual, right? It's the display, it's the expression as seen by others, as observed by others in the room. But we do not study what they say. And so I think it'd be really interesting to match. There's some work on kind of the strategic use of emotions. And I think that's a really interesting area that's kind of ripe for exploration. And just in general, like questions that get closer to the reality of how nonverbal behavior works is kind of wide open.
Yeah, because the old adage, 80% of all communication is nonverbal. Two things that jump out at me. One is, as we have become more remote as a workforce, we're doing a lot more Zoom calls, like we're here sitting on a Zoom call. And one of the things that becomes really apparent to me in a Zoom call is I'm looking at your face. Like all I see is really your face. And so any question, eyebrow raise, whatever, it's just expanded, and I noticed it a ton more than I think even when I was in a meeting, because I'm not looking at everyone's face at the same time in an in-person meeting, but on a Zoom, I kind of am looking at everybody's face at the same time. So much more likely to pick these things up. So I think there's a sensitivity to this that a lot of people are recognizing. And so I think that's kind of really cool as well. Okay, my next question. And this is going to thinking about leadership in general. And so emotional intelligence. I don't know, I teach leadership classes. We talk a lot about emotional intelligence. And some of emotional intelligence is kind of like what you talk about, understanding other people's emotions and then maybe using your emotions strategically. What, based on kind of what you've seen here and kind of the outcomes, how should leaders think about balancing emotional displays, anger and happiness, but, stay away from maybe the negative outcomes that might come from some of these things, right? We haven't talked about it yet, but I could see how someone using anger could actually lead to a less beneficial outcome or a decision, right? And so what do you think is some advice that you might give to leaders about emotional displays?
Sure. Yeah. So I think just kind of fundamentally to know it's about kind of self-awareness that the emotions we display can significantly influence how others respond to us and how we can sway decisions. I think the anger finding is maybe particularly interesting because it speaks to this like direct focused exchange versus a broader discussion. So the fact that we find that how long the discussion unfolds, that one moderator that we do find, that it's kind of the awareness of how this discussion's unfolding and thinking about things like board socialization or new executive socialization in this setting, and more on the strategic use of emotions and just kind of the like you said, the importance of emotional intelligence, like how managers know themselves and how others respond to us has an impact on how we can influence organizations and those around us.
I think I agree. I also wonder about I'll use a sports analogy. We're in the middle of college football season, so there are certain coaches that are very reserved. They speak calmly and they never get to it. And there's others that are screaming lunatics. And I always get a sense that impacts the way everyone else makes decisions and operates. And so I'm really fascinated in this idea about maybe understanding the systemic predictors of how this works, because everyone says, oh, there's a lot of different ways. You can be a blustery leader. You can be a reserve leader. And both of those are fine. But I think understanding how to respond emotionally, that's not something you can just opt out of. You can't just be emotionless, right? And so there's a lot here, I think, to explore. So that's very cool.
I think it's interesting, too, what you said about the different types of leaders. How does that relate to those around them? To the groups, to the teams that they build in terms of their executive teams and the composition of the board relative to that type of leader. It could be that this is another way to get to that, to some of those contextual factors. Maybe it matters differently when you have various combinations of kind of personality and leadership style between the CEO and the rest of the team vis-a-vis the board itself. That would be cool to explore.
All right. The other thing you reminded me of, the one moderator that did work, because I have a question about a moderator that I'm sure you tested that didn't work that I'm curious about. But the length of time that you spend on a topic. This is also something that drives me crazy in meetings. Like when you're like, all right, we got 6 things. Why are we spending so much time on this one piece? But what you show is that the effect of anger, right, of getting people to move dissipates or is attenuated the longer that you discuss the topic. Is that correct?
Correct. So if we have a short discussion of an agenda item and I'm really angry and telling you what I want to change, the CEO is more likely to change. But if that discussion continues to kind of drag on, then that display of anger by me is less likely to have an impact.
All right. So I love this because I can't think of a single time where I've been in a meeting and someone gets really angry and everyone's like, we should talk about this a lot more. Normally people are like, hey, we're running hot. Let's move on, right? Like you want to kind of shut it down because it's uncomfortable to have someone kind of do this. And so what I got is actually you kind of can't run from the anger, or I don't say you shouldn't, but it's probably a better idea to discuss that out such that one person's display doesn't shift the decision making too much, right? Because under the idea that one single person maybe shouldn't have too much sway. And so that I found was interesting because anger is not something that people tend to want to dwell on, right? And so what are your thoughts on this idea of staying with the anger or keeping on topic even when someone has displayed anger about something?
I think that's an interesting question because it speaks to the different pathways that we uncover here. That the anger just works. It only worked in our study directly to someone else. Once it becomes a broader discussion, that anger doesn't matter. Or if it's in terms of the outcome, how it actually impacts the board's vote, my anger doesn't change the way the board votes. It's my peak levels of happiness that are displayed that help improve others' receptivity to my idea when it's a board-wide vote. So I think it's just a really interesting kind of observation about how these two pathways work. That it's almost like the CEO is ready to move on and get out, kind of step out of that discomfort. Not that it's a guarantee that you're going to get what you're asking for, but we found it really interesting that across all of these different topics, across all of the different contexts that the different moderators that we studied, nothing else changed that impact.
So if you were someone that was maybe a little Machiavellian and wanted to use anger to achieve means, but your goal was to change the minds of your fellow board members, anger is not effective. And there's where the happiness is effective. So that's valuable. Yeah. Okay. Last question on this, and this one blends in something that I'm sure you looked at, which is demographic differences. Because another thing that immediately popped into my mind is that there are often, depending on your demographics, there are different emotions that you might feel comfortable displaying or not displaying, right? That people might withhold certain things if they are in an underrepresented group, demonstrating anger if maybe stereotypically you are thought to be angry. And so you want to withhold that. And so to what extent do you think that these two things combine? I'm sure you tested this in a certain way, but what are your thoughts on how those two things interact?
So first, I would say I just had looked back at my list of moderators because I wanted to be able to accurately present these 38 different moderators that
you're not going to list all 38 now because we don't have time for that. Okay,
absolutely no. But what we found so interesting is that, and maybe again this speaks to the context that that's a more homogenous setting there perhaps than other places, other organizations around the world. But that the gender of the board member, the gender diversity of the group broadly, the ideological diversity of the group more broadly, didn't seem to have any impact. And we also you had said something about this person that's generally angry. We also looked at how different is this display of emotion from the way they typically behave. Is it somebody that just tends to be angry or tends to be happier, and that makes their peak display less impactful? But it didn't matter. It didn't matter when they showed the emotion. It didn't seem to matter who they were. What you're saying is absolutely true. I think, I have a couple studies that look at women's influence at the top of organizations, and really interesting work on how diversity impacts decision making. And you're right that one of the real challenges that minority members face is being able to access influence when stereotypes would maybe hinder others' reactions to them. I have one qualitative study. We interviewed 50 women corporate directors, and they would talk about their efforts to manage their emotional displays because there are kind of these ideas about emotions running rampant in board discussions, but the women say it's not them. They're not the ones with those extreme displays because they know that things like this stereotype of women being hysterical, that they feel like they have to be very mindful about how they manage their emotions and their words.
All right. Okay. So it sounds like we got to do this with U.S. companies and Canadian companies and Chinese companies, and then we'll be good. All right. So that's like 8 more AMJs that you can publish after this. Great. I look forward to those. Okay. I'm going to take us out on 2 fun questions. So the first is really diving into what is piquing your interest now, right? Like research in our field is generally driven by us viewing or observing a phenomena that we observe but don't understand. And so are there any sort of trends, phenomena, behaviors that you see that puzzle you that have piqued your curiosity recently?
Sure. So the study I just mentioned, kind of in that theme of emotions and influence, I'm really intrigued how women gain influence in contexts where they lack power, they lack status. And continuing kind of to study boards, I'm also interested in how activist investors have this really significant influence over what's happening. And I think emotions play a role there too. There's a couple forthcoming theory papers in AMR that explore that, as well as kind of how boards manage bias in decision making. So there's some really cool conversations kind of unfolding in that space, and we have more innovations in empirical methods that are letting us test some of those theories.
Yeah, I should note we won't nerd out too much on this podcast, but the technology that you used to get measures of displayed emotion was really interesting. And like I said, as we know, a lot of these meetings now are hybrid. And so everyone is recording themselves and their faces, and you can get this data more easily than you could when everyone was meeting, off in a private room somewhere and no record of what was said and what have you. And so that aspect, I think, is also really interesting because it opens the door for a lot of research in a lot of different areas. All right, last question. What are you reading these days for fun?
So I love historical fiction. I'm a really big Kristin Hanna fan. Fortunately, I'm part of a book club that pushes me to read other things. We do so much reading for this job, and then I'm constantly reading parenting books. I just started The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. So sometimes reading for fun kind of gets lost, but I did just read Kristin Hanna's The Women. And then, again, thanks to my book club that alternates who gets to pick our monthly read, Demon Copperhead, Remarkably Bright Creatures. And I just did, it's part of the start, I think it's a trilogy, but I've only read the first two, The Girl in His Shadow. So I try to find time and I do all of this Audible. I listen to audiobooks. I can't, if I open a book, I'm going to fall asleep. So it's all on Audible.
It's all Audible. And while you're driving around, while you're working, while you're working out, all that, you're listening to books. And then,
I have kids that are in the middle. So I also get to read and reread some great children's books. My 10-year-old and I just did Holes by Louis Satcher.
Oh, yeah.
And I can't seem to stop recommending the Wings of Fire series. I don't know if you've done this one with your kids, but they're so good. And those are the books that got my youngest from graphic novels to like full textbooks. So, I feel like at parties, I'm often recommending this children's series to everyone I'm speaking with because they're just so well done.
You're so fun at parties, Christy. Like, hey, y'all, have y'all read this book about dragons? No, not that one. This other one, Wings of Fire. My son is a Wings of Fire crazy person. I finally got him to recognize that your library has these books, so we can stop buying them because there's like 1 million of them. And so now he rents them. And now my daughter, who's 2 years behind him, has started. So now she's at like book 3. And she's
so good.
Up at night, lights on. I'm like, what are you doing? I just want to finish this book. I was like, oh no, this book is good. So I have yet to read one. I just can't. But I recognize I'm just going to miss out tonight. No, but that is good. I love historical fiction as well. I'm trying to remember. Oh, Eric Larson. Do you read any of his stuff?
I don't. I get kind of stuck on an author, and I tend to. This is why I need people to push me. So I will write this one down. Yeah.
So Eric Larson, he has written. I guess probably the most famous book is "Devil in a White City," and so he takes real things that happened in history and then tells sometimes a sensationalized version and sometimes a really well documented actual version, just dramatized, about what happened. And so that one was about a serial killer that was living during the World's Fair in Chicago. Okay. And it is an incredible book. It's incredible. And then he's written like 4 more, one about the storm in Houston that almost annihilated the whole city. He's done one about the voyage. I can't even remember the voyage. He did one on World War I in England. I mean, they're all really great. And you learn a little about history. And he tells you, like, these are all facts. Some of the dialogue I've made up, but it's all happening. So I'm a big fan of that. Because then I feel like I'm learning, but I'm also being entertained.
Yeah, absolutely. And Kristin Hanna's book always... like the Nightingale, World War II, Winter Garden is World War I. They always have a part that I'm absolutely sobbing, which is like maybe a strange thing to pick at, to be attracted to in a book, but it's such a great, speaking of emotion, such a great emotional release in a way that, it's part of entertainment. It's not, it's not necessarily true to my own life. So it's an escapism.
The key question is, are you crying reading Wings of Fire? Have those brought you to tears yet?
They have not. They have just encouraged me to tell everyone I know to go read them.
Duly noted. All right, get out there, read Wings of Fire, all y'all. It's great. There's like 1,700 books, so you can read it forever. Thank you, Christy, for taking the time. Pleasure seeing you and talking with you, and I look forward to catching up with you sometime soon.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, that's it for the Lit Review. I appreciate Christy for her time, and I appreciate you all for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the Lit Review podcast. You can find this podcast by searching The Lit Review and AMJ podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and other podcast platforms, as well as on the AMJ homepage. Thanks to the Academy of Management for their support for this podcast. Very special thanks to my producer, Holly Fearing, for all of her work behind the scenes. Our theme music is produced by Key to Life. This is Sekou Burmese. See you next time. Take care and be good.